Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7. So, we're not getting the Clone Wars panel for another day or so, and the Star Wars Publishing panel for another 2 days or so at San Diego Comic-Con, so thought I would go back to a couple of topics that I had wanted to cover during Anniversary Week and just didn't get the opportunity to do so. And one of them had to do with the biology of the Force, and was inspired by more from George Lucas about what his ideas were for the sequel trilogy, and all that stuff really kind of gets blown out of proportion in a way. I mean, if you think about how different things were, say, for example, with The Empire Strikes Back and Leigh Brackett's original script to what actually ended up on screen, the whole movie development process is just absolutely nuts. I mean, Han was going to be going to his father for financial support. Luke's own father was going to be a Force ghost and make him take the oath of the Jedi Order. Like, all that stuff was actually in the original draft for The Empire Strikes Back, and clearly that is not the draft that actually became the movie itself. So when you hear George Lucas talking about his ideas for the sequel trilogy, you kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. I mean, even the original Star Wars, he had multiple versions of that in draft before it actually became a working script, and there were changes made on the fly. And let's not forget, he changed it 20 years later for the special editions. So, there's only so much faith you can put on what he actually said. But there was one thing that came out recently that I thought was really quite fascinating, and it's something that I wanted to look at from another angle entirely. So in this big book called The Story of Science Fiction, where James Cameron is interviewing people and interviews George Lucas, there was a section in there about what George Lucas's idea was for the sequel trilogy, and this is the part that I want to share with you. Lucas says, everybody hated it in Phantom Menace when we started to talk about midichlorians. There's a whole aspect to that movie that is about symbiotic relationships, to make you look and see that we aren't the boss, that there's an ecosystem here. Then Cameron says there's an ecosystem inside us called the microbiome that they're just learning about now. And Lucas says the next 3 Star Wars films were going to get into a microbiotic world. But there's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the Whills, and that's Whills, probably familiar. And the Whills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. And Lucas then later says, back in the day, I used to say ultimately what this means is we were just cars, vehicles for the Whills to travel around in. We're vessels for them. And the conduit is the midichlorians. The midichlorians are the ones that communicate with the Whills. The Whills, in a general sense, they are the Force. And then to build on that, let's turn to none other than Qui-Gon Jinn for an explanation of midichlorians.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. When you learn to quiet your mind, you'll hear them speaking to you.
I don't understand.
With time and training, Annie, you will.
So the pretty clear parallel here is that midichlorians and mitochondria are supposed to be kind of a similar thing. So you could say that midichlorians are the mitochondria of the Star Wars universe. I mean, just because these folks are human in Star Wars doesn't necessarily mean that their whole biology is similar to ours. In fact, it takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So you can imagine if you really wanted to try and draw a link between Star Wars and our current present universe, that midichlorians eventually evolved into mitochondria, right? But be that as it may, if you're going to talk about the Whills then in relation to the mitochondria, well, as James Cameron pointed out, there is a microbiome that we're only starting to discover and learn more about now, and that is the microbiome that lives inside our guts. Now, most of that microbiome lives in your intestines, and most of that microbiome, about 2/3, give or take, is actually unique to each individual. So is it possible, because I haven't heard Lucas draw this parallel himself, but it certainly seems to be a logical one, that the Whills would be the Force version of the gut microbiome? It seems like a pretty reasonably logical conclusion to go to that level. And so then you go next to the democratization of the usage of the Force, the idea that it's not just one bloodline that can use the Force in a demonstrable way. It's actually a whole bunch of different people and a whole bunch of different species that can do it. And we see that democratization of the usage of the Force in the prequel trilogy with, all the Jedi in the Jedi Order and the fact that they're always looking for children who are manifesting the Force. And it's actually an idea explored in Star Wars Rebels as well, where the Empire is trying to locate Force sensitive children and gather them up for nefarious means. And the idea is essentially carrying forth in the sequel trilogy as well, because we're not focused on the Skywalker bloodline being the only bloodline where Force powers are actually possible. In fact, Rey is not, by all appearances, a Skywalker of any kind. And the kid that we see at the end of The Last Jedi, I mean, I'm willing to bet that that's not just another, random Skywalker kid and just Luke was traveling around the galaxy sowing his wild oats or anything like that. I mean, that would just really be straining credulity. And ultimately, it would kind of violate the ideas of the prequel trilogy to begin with. So, questions about how this would have affected the actual storytelling of the sequel trilogy aside, I'm really fascinated by this microbiome idea and, about how anyone would actually look into it from a scientific perspective in Star Wars. Like, is there a Jedi scientist that would be trying to explore the microbiome in Star Wars? That just seems really kind of fascinating to me. Not from a movie perspective necessarily, but something to pursue in the books or something like that. I'd be very curious to see that. I'd love to know if you'd be curious to see something more in that regard too. So drop me a comment wherever you're catching this episode of the podcast and let me know what you think. And that's going to do it for this episode. Over on the audio version at sw7x7.com/iTunes or /Spotify or /Overcast or /Google Play, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm doing Last Jedi trivia, so do check that out. For now, though, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for watching, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.